So welcome everyone to the seventh in a row of the vast project webinar series. Today we have with us Sara Graça da Silva and Alba Morelon DS5, and we are running the webinar named Once Upon a Value, the Cultural Significance of Folktales in a European Context. Ladies, the floor is yours. Sara, if you would like to go ahead first.
Thank you so much, Elena, and hi to everyone watching. Thank you so much for organizing this series of webinars. It's a pleasure to be representing Nova's team here with my colleague, Dr. Alba Dias-Faes. Today, we'll talk a little bit about the cultural significance of tales and how they relate to values, kind of condensating the work we've been developing in our pilot for the VAST project. My work, I'm a researcher at Nova University of Lisbon. I have interests in intersections between literature and science, also in evolutionary readings of literature and questions of emotions and morality. Not sure if there's any logistic
No, you can share your screen.
Yes, okay. So I'll start. Okay. Okay. Wait, sorry. Okay. Can you all see?
Yes.
Right. So we don't want to delay you more than you have to. I hope you enjoy our presentation. We expect to be around 20 minutes each for our presentations. And so if there's nothing else, I'll start. Right. Regarding our presentation, and when talking about folktales, it's important to say that when considering folktales, one is almost impossible not to think about the power of storytelling and its role in the construction of the self. And when I say self, I hear talk about a body with memories and emotions and specific cultural values. In every discussion about identity, the notions of time and value, and here value meaning what matters to us, are pivotal in shaping emotional responses as, and I'm going to quote a sentence I really like by a sociologist, Jack Bartlett. He talks about experiences of involvement. And I really like this because although the study of these experiences of involvement has often been circumscribed only to psychology and philosophy, literature, and traditional literature in particular, are excellent sources for the study of this involvement through the communication of stories. Indeed, as literary scholar Jonathan Gottschall puts it, we are, and I love this expression as well, storytelling animals. So when we think about storytelling, we normally think about narrative. And when we think about narrative, we tend to immediately associate with the written tradition. However, narrative has several other equally important dimensions. There are oral narratives, visual narratives that have existed for a long time, even in pre-literal cultures that depended on storytelling to preserve their customs, their history, and their values. In a recent study about the importance of narrative, I'm just gonna put this down. In a recent study about the importance of narrative, Cambridge archaeologist John Robb suggests that the Bronze Age saw the birth of narrative art, with the imagery moving from schematic single motifs to arranged groups, often in action poses or scenes with identifiable people, animals, and objects, basically episodes chronicling community life and aspects of personhood. This visual storytelling is populated with elements that are easily recognizable by a broad audience and has references to explicit actions such as the ones portrayed in illustrations. We see, for example, people plowing, warriors fighting, a boat with a crew, a rider mounted on his horse, a hunter chasing animals, sexual intercourse, and so on. This sense of belonging, the sense of transmission, and importantly of preservation, is also central in folktales as cultural artifacts. Recent studies about the evolution of cultural diversity suggest that the relationships among many languages, social behaviors, and material culture often reflect deep patterns of common ancestry that can be traced back hundreds or even thousands of years. Theories concerning possible relationships between storytelling traditions and descent histories of populations have actually a long pedigree and were central to the concerns of pioneering folklorists in the 19th century. Wilhelm Grimm, for example, argued that the traditional German tales that he and his brother Jacob had compiled were actually remnants of an ancient Indo-European cultural tradition that stretched from Scandinavia to South Asia. He says, the outermost lines of common heritage in stories are conterminous with those of the great race which is commonly called Indo-Germanic, and relationship draws itself in constantly narrowing circles round the settlements of the Germans. It is my belief that the German stories do not belong to the northern and southern parts of our fatherland alone, but that they are the absolute common property of the nearly related Dutch, English, and Scandinavians. It is important to realize that this cumulative aspect of folktales was also observed by the renowned American folklorist Steve Thompson. He states that, like other elements of culture, folktales are not a mere creature of chance. They exist in time and space, and they are affected by the nature of the land where they are current, by the linguistic and social context of its people, and by the lapse of the years and their accompanying historical changes. When we think about terminology related to folktales, we have to consider the original, not original, but the most established term, which is the German word Märchen. Apologies if my German is crap, which is usually translated into English by fairy tale or household tale, and to French as conte populaire. And these are the international established terms associated with the genre. These tales generally involve some type of quest or search that the hero or the heroine must undertake. So the term folktale is normally understood as the umbrella term encompassing a variety of narratives, from legends, myths, fairy tales, and so on, whilst the fairy tale has certain specificities which makes it easily recognizable. A good definition is the one advanced by Thompson, who describes them, a fairy tale, as a tale of some length involving a succession of motives and episodes. It moves in an unreal world without definite locality, and I would add temporality, or definite characters, and is fueled with the marvelous. In this never land, humble heroes kill adversaries, succeed to kingdoms, and marry princesses. In the second part of this webinar, my colleague Alba will develop these ideas further. But for now, I'd like to tell you that in the Bible of folktale studies, the Arndt Thompson Uter Index, fairy tales are included in the Tales of Magic category. As you can see here, the index presents 7 categories, and the Tales of Magic are the most extensive group, comprising tales 300 to 749, in which the canonical fairy tales, or Märchen, are included. All these tales, the Tales of Magic, and not all, but most of them, have been long part of our imagination. We can think about Beauty and the Beast and Sleeping Beauty or Little Red Riding Hood. The ATU catalog, I've said, is considered the Bible because it contains over 2,000 distinct, cross-culturally stable international tale types. Based on a numeric system, as you've seen, and distributed among more than 200 societies. It consists of 3 volumes. The first 2 volumes contain the type catalog. As you can see here, Tales of Magic are included in the first part. And the third one, the appendices and the bibliography. It is organized according to thematic types, which are composed of individual plot elements or motives. And it provides a description of each tale type and each tale type has a brief plot summary, followed by references to catalogs and texts and publications in various languages where that particular tale is present. This is extremely important because it allows researchers to easily identify the underlying structure of a tale and to cross-reference it with any other tales from all around the world which share the same elements or themes. From a narrative point of view, folktales are incredibly versatile, as they adapt to the needs and values of the teller and their culture. Their origin, however, is one of the biggest mysteries in the fields, and this is because the reconstruction is often frustrated not only by difficulties in defining the genre itself, but also as a result of the rich interplay between oral and written traditions. While, as we have seen, Wilhelm Grimm believed that many folktales were likely to be thousands of years old, only a tiny minority can be traced back to before the emergence of the literary fairy tale in the 16th and 17th centuries, using the conventional historic geographic method. And why is this? Because data is missing. This has led to intense debates about the presumed antiquity of traditional tales, with some researchers claiming that many canonical fairy tales may actually be relatively recent literary inventions. In 2016, together with a colleague from Durham University, Jamie Tarani, I explored this interplay between the oral and the written record precisely in the Tales of Magic, in which the canonical fairy tales are included. In our study, we try to disentangle the specific legacies of common descent and regional diffusion by investigating how far back lineages or vertical transmission in tales could be traced. To do this, we use phylogenetic methods. These methods were initially developed in biology, but have more and more been used and employed to investigate relationships between, for example, population histories and a number of cultural phenomena, such as languages, marriage practices, political institutions, material culture, for example, tapestry, music, among many others. And these methods are very useful when data is missing, which is the case with folktales. So very quickly, we used a tree of the Indo-European language to trace the descent of shared tales and to see how far they could be demonstrated to go back in time. Our method of mapping the stories through common languages and geographical proximity worked because of two reasons. On the one hand, in oral tradition, folk tales are transmitted through spoken language, so a correlation might be expected. And on the other, both languages and folk tales are transmitted from generation to generation. So we recorded the presence of each of the 275 tales of magic present in the ATU to the 50 Indo-European populations in the tree, and were able to reconstruct evolutionary relationships for 76 of them, tracing their ancestry back by hundreds or even thousands of years. As we see here, and if you're interested in the study, you can access it. It's on the Royal. I missed the name of the site. Royal Society, sorry, Royal Society site, because it's there in open access. So, but very generally here, I won't go in any details. So you can see that the number of tales that can be inferred in ancestral tale corpora decreases as we approach the root of the tree, with a concomitant decline, obviously, in the reliability of these reconstructions. However, despite these limitations, we were able to trace the inheritance of several tales deep into the Indo-European prehistory. Analysis showed, for example, that tales such as The Jack and the Beanstalk was rooted in a group of stories classified as The Boy Who Stole the Ogre's Treasure, year 328, and could be traced back to when the Eastern and Western Indo-European language split more than 5,000 years ago. Beauty and the Beast and Rumpelstiltskin are about 4,000 years old, according to our study. Even more remarkably, the analysis we conducted were able to infer the presence of one tale, 330, The Smith and the Devil, in the last common ancestor of the Indo-European family, the Proto-Indo-European, estimated to date back 6,000 years ago to the Bronze Age. The tale of the Smith and the Devil is very stable throughout the Indo-European-speaking world, from India to Scandinavia, and its basic plot concerns a blacksmith who strikes a deal with a malevolent supernatural being it the devil, death, or a jinn, or etc., depending on the version, on the country, on the region within that country. The cunning smith exchanges his soul for the power to weld any materials together, which he then uses to stick the villain to an immovable object. This sticking the villain to an immovable object is actually a very transversal motif around throughout folktales. The likely presence of this tale in the last common ancestor of the Indo-European speaking cultures resonates strongly with wider debates into Indo-European prehistory, since it implies the existence of metallurgy in Proto-Indo-European society. Again, if you're interested in reading more about this, you can go back to our study in the Royal Society page. All in all, and I'll now return to my initial claim as I try to wrap up my intervention, folktales' enduring appeal is intrinsically linked to the power of storytelling and magic from time immemorial. There's a quote by two cultural psychologists which I greatly admire, Jesse Graham and Jonathan Haidt, and that I find that it perfectly sums up what I've been discussing so far. They say people love stories. Cultures rely on stories to socialize their children, and narrative thinking has been called one of the two basic forms of human cognition. Successful stories, the ones that get transmitted, and I would add, preserved, are those that fit well with human mind by eliciting strong emotions. Indeed, it is through shared stories that we build our sense of self and social identities, ascribe value to experiences and things, and feel motivated to act according to common beliefs. Moreover, the motives present in fairy tales comprise dichotomies that reflect timeless human preoccupations, such as the fight between good and evil, between right and wrong, punishment and reward, moral and immoral, male and female, and so on. Ultimately, despite being often disregarded as fictitious and even as a lesser form of narrative, folktales are excellent case studies for cross-cultural comparison and studies on human behavior. As my colleague Alba will discuss in a moment, while these tales are now often popularly conceived of as children's stories, this belief is actually a 19th century construct, as they were once primarily enjoyed as adult entertainment. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I'm just going to share my my screen. Ooh. All right, so thank you so much. So my name is Alba Morayon, and I'm a fairy tale scholar who works as a postdoc in Nova University of Lisbon. And my colleague Sarah has talked a bit about quite a bit about the connections between tales, but I want to talk about their cultural specificity, actually. So on the second half of the webinar, I'm going to talk primarily about the Grimms and about the influence they had in the transformation of the fairy tale and in our current understanding of what a fairy tale is. And I will also talk about Disney and the role Disney had in also constructing a sort of present-day idea of the fairy tale. So the goal of this part of the webinar is to show how these stories often, as I said, reflect cultural or specifically cultural specific values, and also to hopefully help you understand that even though they have things in common, they are not as universal as we might think. All right, so just to give a little bit of context on the Grimms, they were both born in the late 18th century in Germany, and they were influenced by a robust work ethic and also devout religious upbringing. But their early life was shaped by some traumatic experiences, especially the death of their father, but also their experiences in high school, where they attended with some aristocratic peers, and they themselves were not aristocratic. So basically, this sort of informed their ideas of social difference, social class, and so on. And all of this influenced their fairy tale collections later on in life. But I would say that what really influenced them was the socio-political context of the early 19th century in Germany. Once they went to university, they studied law, they were influenced by their professor, von Savigny, who was a professor of law, but he influenced them to study ancient German literature and folklore. And through him, they also became involved with the German Romantic movement, and soon took on the task of collecting folktales, with the idea of helping construct a sort of unified German national identity in a time of severe fragmentation. For instance, this picture here is a map of the German Confederation of the 19th century, and you see that you had a lot of different sovereign states, not a unified German nation. So as the result of their folkloristic and nationalistic work was Children and Household Tales. This was a collection that they first published in 1812. But by their own admission, this is an attempt to preserve German oral tradition, which they thought, or they feared, that it was disappearing in a moment of like urbanization and so on. And this was a general fear amongst European romantics. And so as part of this project, they portrayed their tales as emergent from peasant informants, so like mostly illiterate peasant informants. But more recent scholarship has actually shown that most informants were probably middle class, even aristocratic. So they were closer in sort of like social standing to the Grimms themselves. But through this sort of mischaracterization of their sources, the Grimms contributed to an understanding of fairy tales as emerging from the illiterate oral tradition, even when they don't, even when they are severely filtered through the lens of literate men, middle-class literate men in this case. Because indeed, they heavily edited their tales over time. And this is very easy for us to know because between 1812 and 1857, they published 7 different editions of their collection. And from one collection to the next, you can trace the significant thematic, formal, and stylistic differences, the changes they made from one edition to the next. And Wilhelm specifically was the one in charge of making most of these changes. And one thing he did, for instance, was excluding certain tales from one edition to the next. For instance, tales that he considered to be too French, coming from the French tradition, so it didn't quite fit the sort of German project. For instance, Puss in Boots. This is a traditional French tale, and it was in the first edition of their collection, but by the second edition, it wasn't there anymore. And then other tales, for instance, that he considered to be too gruesome or too violent. For instance, How Some Children Played at Slaughtering, which is a tale in which a group of children essentially kill another child. But apart from these omissions, he also altered narratives to fit contemporary sensibilities, contemporary values. One change that I think is quite surprising for people in general is that they introduced brutal punishments to evil characters. So for instance, their version of Cinderella has the evil stepsisters blinded by birds. Basically, birds peck their eyes out. And the evil queen in Snow White is made to dance to death in burning shoes. And this happens during Snow White's wedding, and it's cause for celebration. And so these elements are additions by the Grimms, and they suggest a preference for a harsh and sort of punitive form of justice. And other changes they made might not be so surprising for us from our present day perspective. But for instance, they worked to desexualize these tales that, as Sarah mentioned, until the 19th century, they were not necessarily for children. Even during the Grimm sort of the timeline of the publishing of their collection, it was not for children quite yet. They were often part of adult entertainment, or at the very least they were for the whole family. So they had a lot of references to sexuality. And so, for instance, in a draft that was found about on the Frog King, which is also known as the Princess and the Frog, Frog Prince, you know, different names, we find that the prince, newly transformed into a human, falls in bed immediately with the princess. But by the second edition of the collection, this tale had changed significantly. So this immediate intimacy was removed by Wilhelm, and he added a formal wedding that was sort of approved by the king. And finally, another element of the tales that they consistently changed was who the villain was in a story. So again, in a manuscript of Hansel and Gretel, what we find is that there is a mother who is trying to convince a father to abandon their children to avoid starvation. But in later editions, the mother is not a biological mother anymore. It's a stepmother who is increasingly cruel. And the father is portrayed as reluctant and caring. And so this change reflects the 19th century ideal of the nurturing birth mother, and also the just patriarchal authority of the father. And of course, it creates this, the epitome of like a fairy tale villain, which is the evil stepmother. So it's obvious, I think, by now that the Grimms were editing their tales to fit particular tastes. But by heavily editing these tales while at the same time insisting that they were authentic folk creations, they also contributed to another misconception that lasts to our days, which is that these fairy tales are universal and immutable, somehow incorruptible. So it doesn't matter who tells them or how many times it gets adapted. It somehow always carries like a sort of a universal message. And I think this is generally a misconception, but it is helped by the fact that Wilhelm cultivated a very distinct literary style that now we associate with fairy tales. But again, this was very much a Grimm thing, which is that he wrote in a rather universal manner. So he removed the specifics of time, the specifics of place, the references to narrators and so on. So systematically, he standardized these tales. So as it were, the Grimms had laid the moral and formal foundations of the genre. And again, this genre was at this point, through the 19th century into the 20th century, was already transforming into a genre for children. And they had great influence in other writers. And also they influenced the fairy tale canon maker of our time, Disney. Who basically, Louis Seifert writes that in the 20th century, beyond the continued production of tales for children, without a doubt, the most important development was the appearance of the Walt Disney Company's fairy tale film, which reshaped cultural expectations for the genre. And so these Disney-inflected cultural expectations have come to define what a fairy tale looks like, how it develops, the moral values it imparts, the elements it contains, and so on, as we will see. But of course, as this is obviously a multinational company with ambitions of global impact, so it is a bit different from the Grimms. But so they tend to be more accessible, these films, they tend to be archetypal, and they cater to a broader demographic. But once more, under that veneer of universal appeal, they hide very potent and very specific ideologies. Because from their inception, Disney films championed a particular and historical form of white capitalist society as the ideal form of society, and also pushed a number of conservative social values, such as absolute morality, Protestant-like work ethic, and traditional gender roles. And this is quite important because these gender roles that were pushed and epitomized by the first 3 Disney fairy tale films, which were Snow White, Cinderella, and Sleeping Beauty, faced significant criticism in the 70s. And this criticism centered on the idea or the ideal passive femininity that was sort of represented in these tales and that was perceived as perpetuating harmful stereotypes for women. And so, yeah, it started with this article by Marcia Lieberman, Someday My Prince Will Come. And it led to, unwittingly, to a broader conversation that actually sparked what we now know as modern day fairy tale studies, which, among other things, is heavily influenced by feminist criticism. And just to illustrate the type of work that we do as fairy tale scholars in trying to unravel assumptions about the genre that we all have, not only, you know, people who know just the normal amount about them, even people who study them come with these assumptions. So I like to use the example of the waking kiss or the true love kiss or the disenchantment by kiss, however you want to call it, this motif that is deeply ingrained in our understanding of fairy tales and particularly Sleeping Beauty tales. But when we delve into the history of the kiss and of these tales, which we do as fairy tale scholars, we find that it is a relatively recent development. So starting with one of the earliest versions of Sleeping Beauty, which is an Italian tale from the 16th century, we find that there is a princess, there is a royal man, a king in this case, but she is not asleep. She's actually dead in this tale. And not only that, but she's actually raped by the king. And she will revive at some point and actually marry the king who raped her. But there's no kiss of disenchantment in here. And then another version of the tale from the 17th century in France. This is extremely influential. It takes a lot of elements from the Italian tale, but it actually softens this death of the princess into 100-year sleep. And that's what we assume that happens in the tale most of the time, right? Like she's asleep for 100 years. She's not raped, thankfully, in this one. But still, there's no kiss. Basically, she sleeps for 100 years, the enchantment is up, and she wakes up of her own accord. The kiss is actually introduced by the Grimms, of course, in the 19th century. And this is a theme that Disney really, really liked. Basically, they popularized the true love kiss across its fairy tale, basically for filmography, beginning with the first one, Snow White in 1937. And this kiss has come to, I mean, he has become a sort of symbol of romantic love, of fairy tale love, of fairy tale salvation. And due to Disney's influence, we expect it to feature not only in Sleeping Beauty tales, but also in tales that never had any kiss to begin with, such as Snow White or the Frog King, who even the versions by the Grimms never had this type of kiss. So this is just an example of how Disney has significantly shaped our understanding of what a fairy tale is and about the morals and the elements it must contain. And just to finish up, as we have seen, the Grimms started their collection as a nationalist project, but ended up laying the foundations for the sanitization and standardization of the genre. And then Disney took these foundations and amplified them, embedding specific values that resonated with broader audiences. And in many cases also substituted or obscured the original narratives. So this Disneyfication of fairy tales has been widely criticized for flattening narratives and for reinforcing problematic gender dynamics, among other things. But it has paradoxically rekindled interest in the original multi-layered stories among scholars and the general public. So as scholars and just as people interested in fairy tales, I think our task is to delve into these layers and to challenge misconceptions that we and others might have about these tales, because they actually tend to be considerably more interesting and, I believe, surprising than we tend to think. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Alba. If there are any questions, you can write them in the chat or raise your hand and we will give you access to the microphone. Okay, so I see no questions. If Sarah or Alba, you would like to add something else, thank you for the presentation. It was very interesting. Please feel free to add anything else you feel like.
Art, I think we covered what we intended to. Thank you for listening.
Yeah, no, I'm thinking of it. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you all and have a good evening.
Thank you, you too.
Bye.